experiences and story on how nudism and being naked helps them to shape their life and improve their day every single day. At nudism.tv, we strive to normalize nudity through dialogue and exposure. And today I'm joined by Lydia. Welcome to Cleveland. Welcome to our studio.
Hello, hello.
It's a pleasure to have you.
Likewise.
Traveling from the far reaches of New York.
Yes.
It's, we actually have a lot of guests that come here from New York.
It's a thing.
It is a thing. Well, it makes sense. It's the biggest city, right, in the country. So
Statistically
yeah, exactly. There you go. Exactly. So it's nice though. People appreciate the smaller demeanor of Cleveland. It's like, oh, New York is so busy. New York is this. There's so much green here. Well, now it's white. It's snowing, and that's not exactly as enticing as maybe greens and reds and tans of fall.
Everyone has their preference.
So we'll have to, we like to bring in our guests a second time. We'll have to get you in, not during the winter or at the start of winter. But we're not here to talk about weather too much. We're here to talk about you.
We could talk about weather and me.
Let's talk about weather and you. But let's begin with you firstly.
All right.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. Give us a little intro spiel, and we'll kind of branch out.
Right. I am I guess I've been saying second generation nudist. I wasn't necessarily in a family that was going to like resorts and specific events, but it was just always clothing optional at home. And so very new age, very, very natural, very organic cotton kind of thing. And when I was in the middle of my undergrad, I started getting into modeling. And when the question of do you do nude modeling, that was the first time I was just like, sure, that's like nothing. And it just became a part of my artistic output.
And the reason it was nothing, it was so, nonchalant for you is because you've grown up doing that your whole life?
I guess.
Is that what makes you nonchalant?
Being naked is just not something that I feel protective about. It doesn't make me feel exposed. It doesn't make me feel self-conscious. It's just sort of like the clothes that I am wearing are of the null variety.
So, all right, you wake up and you open up the closet and you're looking through your wardrobe. When you're putting clothes on, what's going through your mind? Because it seems like clothing for you is just a tapestry that you just put on.
One of the things to shape the body. I actually got into fashion around that same time, and to express myself through clothing choices or not. And it's funny because with my family, it was all very perfunctory and just thrift town, baggy t-shirts kind of thing of, I don't care about these clothes. That's sort of the statement there. And I guess when I was like, oh, the body can be something that we can be expressive about. And I'm a very kinesthetic person. So I relate to my body in a very personal expression kind of way. When the question of to be naked or not, I was like, oh, so the sort of the neutral sense of my body also has a message behind it. And so artistically speaking, it was just okay, this is just another palette or another color on my palette.
And what would that message be?
I mean, visually speaking, my naked body tends to have the expression of I don't know if it's vulnerability or lack of censorship or just authenticity. Because I'm transgendered, a lot of people project onto me that oh, we see your body, therefore your work is about your gender experience, which is frustrating. But I do know that my body is something that I've expressed myself through within that capacity. So body modification kind of things. So yeah, it's just sort of this tapestry that is the history of what my body has been through. So that kind of thing.
Thank you for sharing. Now, you mentioned that you grew up, you're second generation nudist. So
A
let's
legacy nudist, if
a
you will.
legacy. Oh, I absolutely will. We always love having legacy nudists on our studio. In fact, our last guest was a family. It was like
Right.
two siblings and their parents, so it was both generations of this nudist legacy right here in our studio. That was interesting. So always welcome that. What about tell us a little bit about your family and what their nudist experiences are like, maybe even predating you, and how you as a family shared nudist experiences.
Hmm. Um, I know pictures from my like little childhood, like 3 or 4 years old, with me and my sister. We're out in the backyard in some sort of kiddie pool situation, and we're not wearing any clothes. And I think in the '80s, there the sort of like experimental model for parenting was sort of like trying to take shape of like trying to dismantle restrictive or prohibitive messages to the kids, and so they were sort of like very free range with regards to how they parented us. Um, and so, yeah, that whole conversation was just around like what messages are they sending us through their behavior, and so like they were just very relaxed with around clothing, and just bodies were just supposed to be very natural, and just like the typical sort of new age sort of unschooling, what became unschooling model. Um, I guess what I'm getting at is like as time wore on and it was less about how we are being raised, it sort of drifted towards a little bit more conventionalism because they were just doing the nudism lifestyle because it's just comfortable for them as opposed to like a political statement or some sort of liberation. So when we started to get older and my siblings started to go through like puberty and things like that, there was people tended to put on clothes now that people's like, oh, you're having like this discomfort with your body or like sexualized because of hormones, whatever. And they started putting on clothes, my siblings at least. And I was sort of like the last one that like put on clothes, so to speak. I was sort of like resisted it because I was like, this is a sort of a personal philosophy kind of thing that I was like leaning into.
Now, when you're saying you're the last one, how many people in total are we talking about?
There's 4 kids in my family, so 4 kids, 2 parents, and
And all three of your siblings are also embrace nudism and clothes free living.
um, yeah, I think so. I I know that they're starting to have families of their own, and they're probably fairly lax around clothing. I'm not really sure how if they've made strong decisions about that, but I do know that with regard to having visitors or guests at their homes, they tend to put on clothes, and that started happening with my parents when we would come visit because my siblings would bring partners or like friends over, and there was like okay. I remember in high school my siblings would bring friends over and they would be like knock on the door and everyone would be like, dad, put on pants, kind of like thing. It was just like a very sort of cliche. um, but I think my dad started to feel more self-conscious about his body. I think my mom started to just um, I don't know, it just sort of like shifted into a less socially critical space. And then when I went to school and I had the gender transition discovery, and when I came home, I was still fairly lax around clothing. And my mom comes up to me, and I was just coming out of the shower and I was sitting on the couch. Um, and my mom asks me, like, you're making your father uncomfortable. Could you put some clothes on? Because of the gender transition, again, bodies were still not critically considered. They were just sort of like more with regards to comfort.
So what year would this have been?
This was 2003, 2004, maybe. Um, so yeah, the sort of like, I went to a school, Oberlin, which has, nakedness as a sort of like a stereotype almost.
Yeah, very liberal.
One might say.
Hyper liberal.
Hyper liberal. And I was in the hyper liberal of the hyper liberal of the Harkness.
The tippity top.
The tippity top of the nakedy naked.
That's right.
What?
No, it's perfect. Tippity top of the nakedy naked. Sign and date that one. So, okay, three other siblings, a family of six, with your parents and the siblings all combined. And at a young age, everyone's naked. It's just a beautiful naked household.
Right.
At that age, now you mentioned high school, but when you were younger, and do you have any memories of your parents inviting their friends, or you having your friends, or your siblings having their friends, and running into this conflict of, Dad, go put on your clothes, because that's not uncommon, right? That's all of our guests that have these sort of nudist families would run into that situation as well when they invite their.
And the funny thing is, my parents are actually quite isolated. They're not big social type people. They just like to spend time at home, and they don't really have people that they bring over. It was when we as children started to socialize, it was like, oh, right, other people. This has not come up before.
So you never met any other nudists in your...
I heard that I went to this, very like experimental school, like a peace nature school kind of thing, which is, I heard that one of the other families had gone to a nudist beach or something like that, and how it was sort of awkward. And again, we were in Texas. I don't know if I mentioned that.
You grew up in Texas?
I grew up in Texas.
Oh, what part?
Dallas-Fort Worth area. And so this little like new agey enclave was in the suburb of Dallas. And I think there was the intention of liberation and sort of like disregarding of rules, but there wasn't like a super mindful, critical approach to the ramifications of that. Or it was just sort of like I don't want to say ostrich, in the sand kind of moment, but just like rejecting something, but not addressing the reason why that framework is in place. And so that, I think that political level of consideration was just not present in the discourse yet, at least within that community.
You mentioned that you went to some, you said nature-y type school, or tell me a little bit about that.
It was kind of what became sort of like the unschooling movement, where the kids were like sort of dictating their own lesson plans to a degree, and it was trying to meet the kids where they're at, supposedly, but they quickly learned that the kids just wanted to always go to recess.
Imagine
the
surprise.
So strange. So again, there was sort of like this desire to just, relinquish all restriction without really like considering, well, how do we get things done? How does one like engage in an educational process without being, a dictator? How is one a benevolent ruler in the classroom?
Yeah, there's a line to draw. You want to, on the one hand, you want to be, free flowing, but on the other hand, there needs to be some amount of structure and direction for their, education to actually happen.
And a lot of that is about emotional education and understanding of what being in community is, and that sort of, those conversations became more common later on.
What does emotional education mean to you?
Just an openness with discussing emotional experiences, and both validating and acknowledging that some things are hard, just like not having like some sort of toxic positivity, like this I think just like no BS about the fact that we are emotional beings, and it's a very real part of our lived experience. Just like talking about our bodies, like they had like previously no one talked about their bodies because that was the puritanical thing was passed down. Um, I think the next step from that is to talk about the fact that we also have emotional bodies or emotional experiences. Um, and so it's sort of just a half baked endeavor that
I
I feel like has progressed and gone to a better place, in the decades past.
I think emotional education makes sense. I never really heard it in those terms, but I feel like if there was there's all different subjects that we teach in school. If emotional education was one of them, that could probably go a long ways into combating this plague of, you know, or this lack of attention to mental awareness and mental health that's
Exactly.
plaguing the country. Right?
Exactly.
Emotional education would really, you'd be working at almost the root of the problem there.
Sure. And I get into a lot of alternative school models and pedagogy myself, just because I'm a teacher and a aspiring parent. Um, I kids are very smart and they pick up things and they learn how to navigate things intuitively. Like the fact that we live in a physical world with language is just two of the ways that we've decided as humans is like at the forefront of how we want to interact. If you, from the beginning, acknowledge that emotions are a thing, if you acknowledge that spatial awareness is a thing, if you just expose children to these various kinds of intelligences, they internalize it and pick it up and learn how to navigate them. But if you sort of ignore them or pretend like emotions aren't important, they will learn that not to pay attention to that part of their awareness. So yeah.
No, it's a great answer. No one's really mentioned emotional education before. It's not a term I've ever heard. So you got me thinking.
Yeah,
So I think it is important.
the
And I wonder,
there's a multiple intelligences model in emotional intelligence, or EQ is sometimes like a pop psychology way of referencing it.
I've heard of EQ. Besides EQ or emotional intelligence, what other intelligences are there that are?
There's proprioceptive, there's spatial, parallel parking, there's social intelligence, sort of being able to read somebody.
What was that first one you mentioned? Began with a P.
Proprioceptive, it's knowledge of where your body is. So it's a very athletic concept.
Wouldn't that? I mean, that seems like spatial awareness to me.
Spatial awareness is being able to navigate placing things within space, but imagine a gymnast that needs to be able to catch a bar behind them. Like awareness of where your body is in space with regards to its environment is different. Like if you're upside down, can you still navigate and orient yourself? Those are it's a physical understanding, an internal sense, just like taste or touch. Sorry, the neuroscience behind this is something I get into.
No, it's good. So you're very passionate about movement and that.
Exactly. I actually learned that I was kinesthetic later in life. I was a musician all my life and not a dancer. And later in life, I got into dancing, and it kind of was transformative and embodiment, and my whole ability to relate to my physical reality was just very enriching.
Kinesthetic is a word that I understand is important to you.
Yes.
And so I want you to define it for our viewers. What is kinesthetic? What does it mean to you? Just the concept of the word.
Kinesthetic, you know how synesthesia, you sort of associate like a color with a sound or something like that. Uh, Kinesthetic is sort of like having a very strong relationship to a physical experience or sensation, like whether it's a sensory thing or the feeling of jolt when you punch somebody, or on a roller coaster, just like these sort of physical sensations um, are very much uh, in a machine. They're not really sensing their body in every moment.
It's like that scene from The Matrix.
Sure. before you open your mouth. And so like when I go out on stage, it's usually like this very like sort of like pin drop moment where I haven't spoken yet, and I just take this very like pregnant pause of just like arriving, settling into the vibe of being on stage and where I'm wanting to go, and like the audience really like tunes in, and then I open my mouth and like take them on this journey. And that's a very kinesthetic approach because of where it's coming from. Like it's rooted very much in my physical experience.
I think that that example that you give, that resonates with me. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's it's a good it's good in any circumstance when if you're performing or if you have if you're commanding attention for people to be in tune with you. You want them to be on your wavelength so they can receive your message better.
Sure.
You want to put them in a similar mind space as yours as best as you can so they can receive your message better. And that's not something I would have ever attributed to a kinesthetic element. And
Mm.
having listening to your explanation, it makes a lot of sense, and it was nice. I'm glad that you have this. You discover this, and I was able to pry some information about it
Mm.
to hear it from you directly. You mentioned this story from high school. Is this something that's
I have a lot of kind of like emotional stories. I've had a very emotional life. I deal with major depression and like, you know, uh, and it was a sort of beautiful, heart wrenching sort of thing with my girlfriend in high school of eventually getting her pregnant and her having this abortion. But it was like the evening where we did, have unprotected or barrier free sex is so, lush and just like very transcendental. It was just like this beautiful, beautiful thing. And like the audience goes with me on that like lovely, sort of almost sensually giddy experience that high school romance tends to express. And then I sort of drop them down into this space of her going through the abortion, me having gender transition and becoming no longer I'm sterile because of operations that I've had. So like this sort of like lost child that might have existed, but like was definitely not accessible for us, just regards to where we were in our lives. It's a very tender story.
um, I do want to ask about the gender transition.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
It's funny actually because I resisted having my gender transition be the topic of conversation for long periods of time, because I want to talk about other things, and people are just like, "But what about this thing that is obviously why you're different than the average American or whatever?" And so I always felt very hostile toward it. But I had this friend, a comedian, who was producing this naked comedy show, and so I was going to be on stage, and all of a sudden, my body was the topic of conversation, and I was like, "Oh, I have lots of gender like anecdotes and funny stories and blah blah blah." And like I finally feel like they're relevant as opposed to kind of like exploitative. Like when I was like, I'm having to do the thing that everyone wants me to talk about, and it's sort of a pain in the ass. But when I'm like, my body's here, let's talk about it, and it's just like these are the things that have happened, and so it's much more satisfying when it is within the context of like your body is like the subject matter. So let's talk.
so, and I do want to get into the anecdotes too, but tell us about when you realize or how you slowly began to realize that this may be where your life is going to go. This transition is what's going to be right for you. How did that, when did that notion first come into your head, and how did you, go about?
Sure. Like I said, I went to Oberlin, grew up in Texas. I did not have the vocabulary or understanding of the transgender phenomenon. All I knew was the transsexuals, drag queens on Jerry Springer. And I'm like, well, I'm not that. And it doesn't look like my experience or anything like that. So I was just like this very androgynous kid. I did some what I at the time considered cross dressing in junior high, where like this whole Marilyn Manson gothic thing, a lot of like makeup and black lipstick and, like fishnets. And I, wore a little like denim mini skirt, like these, this was sort of like my regalia of rebellion, whatever. And when I got to high school, I was sort of like, well, that didn't work because I didn't really like feel, seen or understood, and that was, ultimately what I was going for. And so I like tried to be the all American boy that people seem to want me to be. I quit all the drugs. I sort of like dated very heterosexual women as opposed to more bisexual women when I was in junior high, and or girls rather. And when I got to Oberlin, I knew I was bisexual. I had come out to my parents as bisexual, and they were like, "Yeah, we know." And when I got to Oberlin, I went to like the sort of the Lambda Union opening thing about, where all the gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans groups on campus. And I saw the two people from the transgender advocacy group stand up and they're like, "Hey, we're TAG, we do this thing, we meet at this time." And I was just like, I had never seen like a transgender person in that context before. I was just like, I have no idea, but I'm supposed to go to that meeting, sort of thing.
Something is drawing me to you.
It was just a recognition, absolutely. And within a few like months, I think it was October, I turned to one of the people in the group and I was like, I think I'm a woman. Well, the moment was I had this internal image of like my self image, like the idea of self within my own internal mental awareness. And that person seemed to have always been turned away from me. They had very long, beautiful hair, but they were turned away from me. And in that moment, that person turned around and there's just a recognition of that person being feminine, female identified, exploring the world from a woman's perspective, that kind of thing. And that's when I turned to my friend and like had this thing. And by January of the next semester, I had switched out my entire wardrobe. There was no hesitation. I'm very blessed in regards to the fact that I've never had a scarcity of courage or boldness, bravery.
And is this boldness and bravery? Does it come from within, or is it aided by a support group beside you?
I mean, it eventually got there with regards to other trauma related, like needing to step forward into uncomfortable space. But for the most part, I think it was born of necessity or just the fact that I came from a family that was very like supportive as far as like self worth, self. I was not really insecure, even though like I was very much like trodden upon and very made fun of in school. Like I was very depressed, but I never had like this question of whether I wasn't a worthwhile human being. So
It's blessed that you had that.
I
It's a
know
blessing to have that kind of a family.
yeah, and it's sort of transformative when I look back on it. I was just like, oh, I have to when I imagine other people's experiences of not having that, it's like I just have like this huge, just like transformation as far as like how that changes one's life experience.
So then by January, you had swapped out your wardrobe,
Right.
and then the rest is history. You were on the
Yeah, I mean, I had a great community there. I connected with like who would become my trans mom in Dallas, and she put me in touch with like an endocrinologist. And I was already on estrogen, and by 2005, I think that was like the end of my sophomore year, I was off to Oregon to have an orchiectomy, and yeah, my body was just I was just like, no looking back. There was no question that this is, whenever I see something as like the obvious step forward, there's no hesitation.
Do you, looking back, do you wish that you had either discovered, transitioned earlier in life, or maybe delayed it a bit? Or do you feel that you did it at the right time?
It's funny that the history of the trans community is sort of like becoming younger and younger, to where a lot of people like they'd just gone with the programming of like get a wife, have kids, blah blah blah, and then like they have sort of like a midlife crisis where it's like, oh, by the way, there's this part of me I haven't been acknowledging, and so that tends to be like the stereotype from sort of like Generation X, and then my generation was sort of like this transitional, pardon the pun, generation where people were getting resources from the internet. There was more like of a community or more of an understanding of like ways of doing it, not as sort of underground or back alley as a lot of early transitioners had, because the resources weren't really available and you couldn't really talk to your doctor about it. And then today, where parents are very educated about gender dynamics and gender exploration for their kids, and there are kids that have never gone through the first puberty. They're either on androgen blockers, or they've had situations where they can never develop that deep voice. They've never developed facial hair, and you come across these trans women or trans girls, and they just look so extraordinarily natural because there's very little of their body that is sort of like competing for those gender cues. So it's really interesting. So part of me like wishes I had transitioned earlier, but it just wasn't really available community wise.
The benefit there, and I'm going to break it down into
Layman's terms.
Layman's terms is the body. There's less to transition from, is what you're saying.
Sure.
If you start earlier,
mm-hmm.
And so that's a benefit to the individual, because it's less of a is it because you don't have to spend time living something you're not, or is it less less of a shock to the body, to the system, to the psyche, to have to go through a greater type of transition?
I don't think it's necessarily a bigger shock. I think it's the same regardless. I think it's just, if you're walking down a path, turning around at any point is going to feel the same. It just depends on how far down that path you've gone and how much longer it's going to take you to walk back. So it's a little bit like that.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And on the terms of a path, before we get too far down, I would like to take a short break.
Sure.
And when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about some of your talents and your hobbies.
Yeah, great.
Because I understand that you have quite a few that you are very passionate about.
Indeed.
So we'll be back with Nudist Talk Radio in just a moment, here with Lydia.
We can do 10 seconds of room tone, so just be quiet for 10 seconds. Audio's off and video's off.
Question: Was there something echoing at some point?
Yeah.
Was there some audio on somewhere? What was the echo from? Where was the echo coming from?
Streaming live to social media, when I turned the microphone off, the echo went away. So I removed it from there, input it into the microphone instead of using HDMI, and then the echo went away.
Mm-hmm.
So the echo was something that was being
There's a feedback
recorded?
loop of the microphone and speaker of the computer.
Right, but so the speaker was on the computer?
Nope.
Okay.
Don't know. I fixed it.
That sounds so bizarre. Like without
I
a
don't know
speaker.
that it just it worked. I got it.
It was a Zoom moment.
Yeah.
Honestly,
Yeah.
life is just a
I
Zoom
heard
moment.
it last time, so
Yeah.
I just turned the microphone off.
Because I heard it and then I stopped hearing it. I was like, oh, okay, maybe I'm just like
No, I
high
figured it
off
out.
something.
It has something to do with it, but it might be, we were plugging into there, it might be the microphone from the camera going into there with that microphone, it might be an echo thing in there. So, but I have to look at the settings, but I got it fixed. It's up.
Awesome.
And what if the
Fix it
volume
on
is
the
just on this camera? We never know for the mic, I don't know.
I think it's because we're zooming in here,
Uh-huh.
this is still recording the microphone in here, so it's the double microphone going into here
Oh.
from there. There's something
Yeah.
with this camera, but
Yeah.
we bypassed it. We're
Right.
good.
Nice.
Mhm.
Sorry
Do it on
for
the fly.
kicking the stand here.
Oh,
You
that
kick the
was
stand one more time. No, just kidding.
That stand will kick right back. And the doobie between your legs, though, you better watch yourself. Fool. I'm gonna just a bit here now that we're not live. All right. Definitely asking you this question could be about I'm transgender and I don't know how it feels. Okay, I think there's a good question to be asked there. There's probably a question that we can fashion about, like, I'm 18, and it would be from an 18-year-old, because it'd be like, listen, my twin sibling and I, also the implications they're 18. My twin sibling and I are nudists at home with my family, and we're inviting my friends over. No, and my parents invite their friends over, but then they also put on clothes. And why are they hiding the fact that they're nudists? That could be a good question. I think we can fashion that. There should be a. Do we have a little stand for the anything we can to put the Gator or the Mountain Dew on?
I won't drink it during the set, during the shoot.
It's not a problem if you do.
Well, I'm not going to.
Well, I didn't want you to anyway, so good. Yeah.
Fine,
Reverse
fine.
psychology. I'm chugging it now. Fuck yourself.
I'll do it
Yeah. And just spill it on your carpet.
right
How about that?
Pour one out for my homies. How you feel about that?
Yeah, for real. Somebody poured one out for me last week. What happened? I can't remember.
Huh?
Somebody's pouring one out for me. Oh, it was my last week hosting trivia on Wednesday night.
now.
So they were like, I did a little speech. I bought the entire bar a shot.
Oh, wow.
58 shots.
Dang.
And we all did a cheers. Gave everyone a little l'chaim.
Hi.
Tossed them a little mazel. They sent me off. I still got my Tuesday gig, so I'll be there tonight.
So you're just doing one
One a
day?
week, yeah. For the next 2.5, 3 months. Yulia's got Yulia's got busy season for her work, so she's got
What does
needs
she
my.
do?
She's a project manager for a real estate investment company.
Mm.
So she and all the deals are closing now at the end of the year. So like she's gonna have late nights, early mornings, and she wants me to not be doing trivia 2 consecutive nights a week. I wish there was a space in between, like Tuesday, Thursday. I
Right.
gotta do this Tuesday, Wednesday shit. So, what's going on here?
I have to potty.
Go potty, go. Thanks for letting us know.
Goodbye. This is where you bow out gracefully. Indeed. I'm so thirsty today.
Clear.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Nudism.tv, Nudist Talk Radio segment. I'm in the studio with Lydia.
Hello.
Greetings indeed. Lydia, we just spent some time talking about your transition back in beginning of the millennium. And you mentioned that there were some anecdotes. You had this vast amount of a plethora of anecdotes. Can you mind sharing one or two with us?
Well, the one that oh gosh, where do I start? I'm like, there's the family one, there's the sex party one, and then there's like the, I guess, pornography one.
Well, you're in luck because we have time for all three. So let's go in order. Family,
Amazing.
sex party, and
pornography.
All
right, here we go. So, like I was saying, I, go back to Texas and, spend time with my family. And,
I'm just going to interrupt you briefly. And I hate doing this, but Texas, right?
Here we go.
To me, it's a very conservative space.
Supposedly.
Did you find yourself living in a conservative space, or was the area you were in a liberal one?
It's very metropolitan. Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin,
so then it's
San Antonio. Like these are major cities. These are cultural centers. The stereotype of Texans, the stereotype of any location, whether it's West Virginia or upstate New York or Long Island, is usually one based on class. And so they look toward people that are disenfranchised, where the specificities of that location are very heightened, and the lack of access to resources cause all these eccentricities to show up with regards to speech patterns or lifestyle. So the stereotype about Texas is very much what rural Texas might look like, just because they're not exposed to the outside world. And a lot of what people call conservative or closed-mindedness or bigotry is literally just lack of exposure. It's not that those people are cruel or don't, they just know what they know. So I get on a bit of an anti-soapbox with regards to people being like, "Oh, Texas, you poor thing," and I'm just like, "Get over yourself. You're not so high and mighty yourself. Like, we all have these struggles. You just have had more access to these cultural differences or multicultural, whatever." Sorry.
No, that's good. No, and it's good to ask because everyone's experience is different, and it's good to hear that you have this almost not blasé, but you have this very understanding kind of mindset as to, even though you weren't necessarily exposed to it, why people are, or why people tend to be, or why people perceive others in such a way. But let's go back to the anecdote, the family anecdote that we're heading towards initially.
So when you're in college, your life is developing at a sort of a breakneck speed, and when you go back to visit your family, I was, drastically different every time, because not only was I changing personality and emotionally, but physically I was changing quite a bit. And the first 3 years of transition are always, regardless of a person's situation, are just like a journey, a journey with a lot of ups and downs. So anyway, I come back and I haven't had my orchiectomy yet, which is removal of the testes. So I still have the full regalia down there. And I was wearing very tight jeans at the time. I was very into like skinny jeans, as was the fashion. And my dad sees me sitting on this couch in the living room. And he notices that I don't have a bulge because whatever reason. I think he was already insecure about my body, and sort of like noticing the changes was sort of like a point of anxiety for him. But
so he knew what you were going through or what you were.
Well, yeah, but he was also like parents get very concerned that their kids are doing things that are unsafe. And so he pulls me aside and he's just like, "What do you do with it?" and he's like confused as to like why tight pants don't reveal my genitalia. And I kind of like, I'm in this sort of militant Oberlin phase at the time where I'm just like scoffing, and it's like, oh gosh, Dad, you're such a, whatever, such a prude or whatever. But the thing that I always give the joke when I'm like doing the actual comedy bit is how, the drag community uses this technique called tucking, where you sort of like sort of insert the testicles that have descended, and you sort of pull back the penis to sort of like hold everything in place, and then you wear very tight underwear on top of it, and it just sort of holds everything in place, and it's, mimics or the flatness of a woman's pelvis. And so, yeah, that was sort of what was going on. But when my dad gets all freaked out, I was like, oh no, she's done something terrible. Or it's just a silly thing. And so, yeah, I didn't tell it as much as in the punchline variety this time, just because it's kind of, I don't want to make him the butt of the joke.
What would the punchline be?
Oh, it's just more in the delivery of just like the quick beats of like pulls me in there, and it's like, yeah, we figured out some things. There's a technology involved, and that kind of sort of disregard for ignorance. But I do have a lot of compassion for people that just aren't exposed to things or coming from a different context.
And really, the whole aim of this nudism.tv project is to bring exposure, with a focus on the naked body, and the trials and tribulations that our guests have gone through, positives and negatives and challenges, and any sort of adventures that were taken with respect to being naked and living clothes free, and this exposure, this dialogue, and any information that we can bring out into the world, we hope will give people that are either wholly unaware or interested in diving in the ability, the option, the means to do so with a greater ease.
I think the awareness and the resources are very valuable with regards to like just being like, oh, this is the thing that I didn't know I was looking for, but this seems very meaningful to me. It's really resonating with me. So I really appreciate that as well.
Yeah, we hope one day when this project is fully live, that people can view this interview and view any of the other segments that we'll have with you, or any of the other segments we've had in the past, or the ones that are yet to come, and they can find one person or multiple people that they can really resonate with and go out on
feel encouraged,
clothes-free adventure of their own.
Yeah.
Okay, so we heard about
my bumbling dad and his fashion nervousness.
That's right. Now let's move on to this sex party. And in fact, I understand that sex parties are more than just an off topic for you. That's like a bullet point for you.
Oh, it's such a bullet point. That's a good point.
So let's first do the anecdotes, get that out of the way, and then we can go back and dive
Well,
in.
it's kind of like the seed that like led me onto my big, my journey into sex parties.
Yeah, that's what I was hoping. I was
well done.
Obviously,
precisely how it was supposed to go.
Yes.
Yeah. So when I first transitioned, I was very like, there's this stereotype almost of transgendered people being very protective or guarded or conflicted about their genitalia, and especially how people view their genitalia, how they refer to it, how they interact with it. Because some of those, like if you have like for me, having a penis and like anything that emphasized the shaft was like, it was really like leaning too much into like the masculine associations with that body shape, that organ. And so I had like this sort of like fixation on people treating my genitalia in a much more like sort of like more what I would describe as like a floral like dynamic, where it's like not really like up and down, but sort of like around and sort of like undulating, interacting with my body. And yeah, I was, it was 2007, I think. I got involved with my first like BDSM club in Ottawa, Ontario, where I had, transferred. And I started dating my first couple. Like I think I didn't have the vocabulary for polyamory when I was in Texas or really when I was in Oberlin, but it all came crashing in. I was just like, oh, I kept on pushing my partners to be open. And like, I was always very drawn to sort of like non-monogamy and group environments. Anyway, I start dating my first couple and we're having like this little weekend in Montreal. And the woman in the couple is we're about to be sexy in the hotel, and I have this whole floral, you know, uh, uh, instructions that I've given her. And the funny thing about this couple is both of them take a lot of work to orgasm. So, both of them are very good at oral sex because they're with a partner that needs a lot of skill.
Right. So you gotta evolve. You gotta get there.
Yeah, you have to build that muscle. And so she has amazing oral skills. And I have like this perception of my genitalia that like, I'm just sort of like trying to make, do with what I have. And she does these things to my cock and I have like it was just persuaded me otherwise of this like doing her thing. And then like the guy comes in and is like, okay, so how do I interact with this penis? And she's just like, just treat it like a penis. It's fine. And I was like, okay, fine. It's just like, okay, you have a point. You and I've been fixating on this and sort of.
But why at that point capitulate? Why say, because as you mentioned, you were fixating on it not being a penis or this floral arrangement or this, but why now at this point say, okay, fine, treat it like this? What changed?
You're right. Sure. I think it was just the fact that I didn't think I could receive pleasure in that way. I think it would be upsetting to me or dysphoric or triggering or any of these sort of things that is like not sexy. But what she did was just extraordinary and turned me on. And I was like, yes, more of this, please. And like, if she's going to refer to it in this way, it's like, I don't need to like tell her the language that she needs to use because what goes on in her head while she does this sexy thing to take away those tools just seems counterproductive. So that was relevant for that. And around that same time is when I started working at this sex club in Toronto as a sex worker and doing like a little independent pornography stuff. And in that environment, I was sort of like just starting to let go of like the Oberlin hyper prescriptive, politically correct, disposition where I need to like tell the world and educate them, and anything straying from that is inflammatory. Because I'm dealing with like everyday people that are coming into this club and like interacting with my body and talking about my body and asking about it. And I was like, trying to come up with like these constructed terminology of like how to refer to my cock it just seemed so inaccessible on like a utilitarian, like how to exist in society, and like language is supposed to be about efficiency and communication as opposed to like obstacles. And, so I was just like, I tried to just like let go of that preoccupation. I was just like, how would I just refer to my cock? How can I imagine being sexy with someone and them referring to my genitalia and just like not having an adverse, have it not be upsetting to me. And cock was really what I landed on. Dick feels a little, less appealing to me. Like a lot of people have different things that they associate.
Is it more masculine?
Oh, well, it's just like there's a, we get into the etymology of things. I think the phonetics of it and just like the association of penetration or protrusion or just like an aspect of something. I think cock was just sort of like this thing. It's just like this part of my body that hangs out. It's like, it is not internal, it is outside. It just sort of cocks out, as opposed to like a dick, which feels very like rude and sort of aggressive for whatever reason.
Were there any other? I mean, there's so many terms. Were there any other terms that you were kind of
considering
before you decided that cock was the?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we can go through the whole list.
No. It just we haven't had a guest that went through this kind of experience.
Sure.
So it's the first time I'm speaking to somebody that has gone through that.
Well, what do you call your genitalia?
I mean, I didn't want to say it here, but don't tell anyone, Mr. Boopsy.
Mr. Boots?
No. Just, I don't know. I don't have. I've never really thought about it. I don't have any sort of.
You've never referred to your genitalia with a partner?
No, I have, but it could be anything. I haven't like excluded.
But what is something that you use?
Dick, penis, cock, any of the above.
Okay. Yeah, and
Mr. Boopsy.
And Mr. Bootsy.
Boop. No, that's a joke. That's
okay.
Not.
Let's keep it in reality. The disposition towards like clinical terminology of vagina, vulva, clitoris, penis, testicles. These things are like very like it's sort of like trying to like rise above the gratuitous or the crass. And I sort of started noticing that sort of like elite or overly sophisticated like signaling for me. And I was like, that never felt natural for me. I think parts of the body that, we don't call this a patella, we call this a knee or kneecap. And it's just like parts of the body that just like feel more pedestrian and conversational, and pussy and cock just seem to be very like, you just know what you're talking about, as opposed to if you're saying penis and vagina and these things that are very much constructed to have a clinical meaning. It sort of takes me out of the conversational rhythm. Let's get into linguistics now.
Oh, well, that could be the next thing. No, it's good insight. Again, like it's never been something any of our guests have ever mentioned. So I'm genuinely fascinated.
Yeah.
You had mentioned, this is your second anecdote, which was the sex worker one.
The second one was treating my penis like a penis.
Right. And you mentioned that you had given the woman in the relationship floral instructions. Can we get a visual aid in here? I'm just what floral instructions? This was like these were like guidelines to the encounter.
Well, sort of like how to deal with the flesh.
Oh,
how to engage with.
Oh, I see.
Like, are you like when you touch a body, you can sort of touch the skin on the surface. You can sort of like engage with the muscles. You can sort of like feel through and palpitate like the skeletal structure, things like that. I went to massage school. It's a thing. So it was like all these sort of like clinical ways of like how you feel into the body. And if you're like focusing on the erectile tissue, that was sort of like at the time triggering to me. And I was sort of like stay in the more fleshy parts and sort of like have this more like the full erogenous zone kind of attention, as opposed to be very like narrowly focused on this shaft head apparatus. So I was sort of just needing a more full service engagement and sort of like if my penis was like flat against my belly and sort of like interacting with the back of it, as opposed to like pulling it out and like having it be this protrusion, sort of like things like that.
Got it. I understand. Mm-hmm. I wasn't sure what these instructions could be, but now that makes sense. Now, this was your first experience with a couple, and you mentioned this was the introduction to your passion for sex parties.
Mm. It wasn't my first experience with a couple. It was my first time dating a couple. Mm. So like having a long-term experience of like, oh, this is the emotional dynamics of your relationship. Here's how I might relate to it. And this is how you relate to me. So that complexity was sort of like, oh, new skills. Yeah, I'd done like the BDSM club for a while, and that was sort of like my home base for community and exploration, and which was lovely. And then I later moved to New York City, and still in that scene. And And I noticed that the more I sort of felt into my own desires, like a lot of my artistic output is with regards to like desires and personal honesty as to like what do I really want in this moment. And the more I became sensate to that, the more these play parties would actually feel very frustrating. And it seemed like I was very much just like fixated on interacting with people's bodies, sort of like, quote unquote, access to their bodies, having that physical dynamic was very much what I was looking for, as opposed to like people that are looking for like a particular kink or fetish to be satisfied. Like the activity is the goal, whereas mine was just like physical people and people that express themselves that way. Affection, intimacy, essentially. And the parties that seem to have like more sexual vibes seem to like really start to gravitate towards that. And when I just sort of like, let the other shoe drop and just go to straight up sex parties that weren't targeted towards the BDSM community, that's when it was sort of like started to click. And I started to notice that I was sexually satisfied for the first time in my life after going to like enough people, having community there and feeling really at home in those spaces. And then, fast forward a few years and I'm working toward, I've hosted a few private parties and I'm sort of working toward pivoting toward more public facing parties.
One thing I do want to ask, given that you grew up in this, you're a second generation nudist, right? Is there some sort of appreciation that you have for the naked body that maybe somebody that isn't a nudist at all would have? Do you think that being a nudist, living clothes free in any way benefited you or offers you a unique perspective at these sex parties? Or at these parties where it's not just people that are naked, it's people that are naked and hoping to find some sort of sexual engagement?
Interesting. It's actually my experience as a massage therapist that sort of transformed my relationship to the body, where it's just like, oh, bodies are just bodies. Because you deal with a lot of different kinds of bodies, and this idea of like only enjoying interacting with attractive bodies or like, conventionally beautiful bodies is kind of broken down when you're in a not just a clinical setting, but a setting in which you're dealing with the general population, as opposed to like the cream that rises to the top that feels compelled to go out and be exhibitionists. So there was that, and I think the foundation in nudism or naturalness, what has like maybe primed me for those insights, as opposed to just tolerating them. Whereas I found it very I think liberating for myself to let go of this preoccupation with certain body types being acceptable and certain body types being unacceptable. And like, I think my disposition personally has always been about compassion and empathy and celebration of everyone's experience sort of having value and being interesting. And whenever I talk to people, they're just like, oh, my life is boring. And that's sort of like a flag of maybe insecurity. I will sometimes have to like, take someone by the hand a little bit conversationally and be like, let's just talk about some of these things. And I can sort of emphasize the parts that are really quite, worth talking about, noteworthy, because I don't think anyone's life is insignificant.
I think people tend to look through lenses on both sides of the equation. Either the rose-colored lenses and you embellish something, or they're these dull lenses where you take something that is otherwise interesting and just perceive it to be something that's ordinary or just commonplace and not in any way fascinating. So it's good that you can sit people down and give them this insight and say, well, no. What you think is one thing may in fact not be that way at all.
And that perception and context and, just how you've been raised to see the world, morals that you've received from institutions, all sort of shape that and how someone perceives themselves.
Do you believe that people that live clothes free or are nudists are more compassionate than people that are not, or have more empathy than people that are not?
There's certainly more inclined toward doing a bit of self-analysis before they leap to a conclusion. There's an association that people that are in a marginalized community, or like, for example, people there's like my parents who are artists. There's like, oh, you would think that because they're artists, they would be more open-minded. This association with progressiveness with regards to marginal experience. And that's not necessarily the case at all. So I think there are plenty of people that are like, this is my thing. And sort of like my progressiveness sort of like goes to the extent of where I am. Everyone that is beyond me is corrupt, and everyone that is above me is closed-minded. So this sort of like locational dependency. And it sort of takes a bit of maturity to extend your own progressiveness beyond what is really necessitated by your daily experience. So yeah, I think people in the nudist community, especially if they're in a context where they have to defend it a lot, there's a lot of, oh, but we're not those kinds of nudists. Oh, we don't engage in those activities because those things are, the insinuation is like those things are dirty. We're the clean ones. And as a sex worker, I'm very familiar with that tendency as well, where you're like, oh, we're not streetwalkers. We're upscale. We, this sort of like class distinction. So yeah, I can be sort of hypercritical of any progressive or liberal disposition, because I'm like, okay, let's dig into things that you maybe paint out of the picture. So
I think that's a good. It's an interesting. It's interesting to hear people's opinions and people's responses on that, because yes, on the one hand, it's people that are, if you can shed the inhibitions and if you can just live your life and you can kind of cast clothing aside and be naked and be free and feel that way, that you would feel that you're just more kind of just open to experience and more compassionate. But then the other side of the coin is, well, maybe there's a certain element of an elitism that may come from being that way. Oh, well, I'm in this like select few. And so, holier than thou.
We are enlightened. Yes.
Yes. No, it goes both ways, of course.
Yes.
But it's, the general consensus, at least the experience that I have from all of our guests so far, is these are compassionate people. And these are people that are willing to lend a hand and reach out and help someone else. And specifically in the sphere of nudism and welcoming more nudists, more people into a clothes-free life. You listed a few things for hobbies, right? Because we asked you to chat a little bit about yourself. You typed up a nice little thing for us. And back to back were sex parties and polyamory. Now, you did go into a little bit just now about polyamory. Now, you mentioned that, and you've said it, I think twice, maybe even three times in this interview so far, how you didn't know what the words to describe it was. Yeah. You didn't know the language. Yeah. You only learned it later. So as far as polyamory goes, at what point did you, maybe you can tell our viewers a little bit about the differences between polyamory and, other adjacent sort of
swinging and non-monogamy of other stripes. Yeah.
How is polyamory different than non-monogamy?
Yeah, like being in an open marriage, for example, is, polyamory is sort of like a fuzzy bubble where it like sort of like peters off, and like it really depends on your context as to like how relevant that label is. Like if you're in a very dense population like myself in New York City, like polyamory seems very specific, and open relationships is sort of like this fringe aspect that engages with the polyamorous community or something like that. Polyamory for me, I'm also sort of like what's called a relationship anarchist, or like a sort of non-hierarchical polyamory, which has where there's not a primary relationship that sort of takes precedent or has veto power over other aspects of relationships. But of course, everyone's a free agent and gets to decide what they want. For me, polyamory is about a future, an intention to develop a life with somebody along side together. Where, like, when you imagine your future, are you taking into account the priorities of your partners? And how big is that realm of consideration? So people that you fuck on the weekends, you kind of don't consult with them whether you're going to have a third child or not, like, or if you're going to move across the country for work. You might tell them, but you don't like really consider that as part of the decision-making process. Whereas your partner, is a more conventional monogamous marriage. If you don't talk to your partner before you decide to make a huge financial expenditure, they will be quite upset.
So in a polyamory, you're saying that there is no one that you really need to talk to, with the exception of your. I mean, you
No.
make your own
That's not
decision?
why I was sort of drawing the extremes there, and the fact that for me, polyamory is about having multiple people that are very much of that checking in with, coexisting with, planning together attitude. So it's sort of like a little bit of an intentional community in that
So
regard.
how many, if I may ask, how many people are in that sphere for you, or maybe at its most, at a peak?
Sure.
How many people were in that sphere of individuals that you would consult with about life decisions and things like that?
Sure. For me, I have like this idealized sort of what some people will call polysaturated, where it's just like, oh, I have all the things that I want. I don't want any more, any less, blah, blah, blah. There's sort of this nice balance. And for me, it's like 3 sort of like very emotionally invested partners, and maybe 3 like a bit more satellite with regards to they have a little bit more freedom to come and go as they please. So ideally for me, it's like that group of 6, and maybe the internal 3 plus myself would be a 4, but not necessarily 2 couples of people that I feel would be like sort of part of this life journey and like building a family together, co-parenting, that kind of thing.
Are these 3 of these individuals that you live with?
No, I actually am recently single-ish. I kind of went from having 3 partners to 0 partners in a short period of time for a myriad of reasons. And it was really rough. So it's been kind of a tough year. But I do know from, just my own personal history that structure, that sort of number of different personalities or individuals in my life, it feels really good.
That's
And
the
like,
sweet spot.
it feels really, yeah.
So, and just my own personal curiosity, traditional relationship, traditional monogamous relationship where it's 1-on-1,
Mhm.
you just have the other person, you compromise, you find out what works, and you move on. In your case, with 3,
Mm-hmm.
how do you compromise 4 ways?
Mm-hmm.
And how is, with 2, it's my needs and your needs. But with
Right.
4 people, there's 4 different people's needs, and each person has their own lives
Mhm.
as well.
Mm-hmm.
So how does a group like that navigate?
I often call polyamory relationships on hard mode, because it is not easier because there's less restrictions on who you can sleep with. Like, it is so much more difficult with regards to self-awareness and owning your own, hang-ups, and just compassion and understanding and communication. So for me, I mean, I haven't done it yet. I haven't tried to venture into that sort of building a family with that cluster of people. But I do know that I don't have any insights because it would just be speculation. But something that has been said to me by my partners is that I seem to be really doing polyamory for the right reasons. Whereas some people are often kind of working through their own emotional trauma or sense of, scarcity, or, these different things that sort of they carry along with them in their lives. And they're sort of like any relationship is like that. Like, people get married for, 1,000 different reasons. And just because there's like some sort of like platonic ideal as to like what a beautifully sort of interdependent relationship where it's not codependent or avoidant, is kind of like just a statistical anomaly of just like this is technically the middle point of balance, but like it's no longer it's no more valid than any other relationship with emotional interactions.
Just the one that you find the most common, maybe.
Not common. No, not at all. I think it's just the technical average. There's a really fascinating actually story about this concept of the average human. It was within the military. They were trying to come up with a uniform that they could mass produce and just like outfit the entire army. And so they measured all of these people, length of arm, width of torso, blah, 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 all these different things. And they came up with the averages of all these different measurements. And there was not a single person in that study or collection of individuals that actually was average. So the idea of average is, like I said, sort of a mathematical anomaly, and it doesn't actually. It's a myth of being average, and so that's to talk about relationship balance and emotional preferences and like, oh, this is what feels good to me. It's just like it's very personal. It's very relative. So I've got a little off topic.
No, that's good. Honestly, it's a good way to explain things, right? You get everyone's average, and then all of a sudden nobody fits in it.
Exactly. So I think just in a lot of ways you just get lucky. People that have overlapping visions, visions that can coexist. One of my proposed partners from before, they and myself are very into co-parenting and sort of group family structures. And when we met each other and had that conversation, we literally lit the conversation on fire because we were just astounded how much we had in common. And we're just like instant kindred spirits because it is so hard, even within the polyamorous community, to find other people that are not just like, oh, that's a neat idea, or oh, maybe if that like becomes convenient for me, I'll maybe explore it. But people who are like, if I don't, manifest this particular structure of family, I will always feel a lack. Like people who are dedicated to certain causes or aspects of polyamory are sort of the things that I kind of have to investigate when I meet someone new. Like if I come across someone and they're like describe themselves as polyamorous and I want to emotionally invest in that relationship and like sort of explore and make myself vulnerable. And then like 2 months later, they're like, oh, one of my partners asked me to be monogamous, so I can't see you anymore. And I'm just like, it feels like they would, falsely represented themselves. They were just sort of dating me as opposed to like exploring a polyamorous development there. I think people that can exist in monogamous relationships, maybe they perceive themselves as sort of fluid with regards to that. If we want to like draw a parallel to sexuality, it's kind of like frustrating for me to engage with. It has to be really worth it for me to be like, oh, you might abandon me just because something convenient came along. And I look for other people that are sort of like comrades in the struggle, as far as like the fact this is the lifestyle that they will fight for.
So there's no chance that you may one day decide, you know what, polyamory may not be for me anymore. Maybe I want to find something different, monogamy or something else.
Right. I tried once, and I was engaged to a woman, and within 3 years, I was already sort of like going out of my mind, and we were just working toward the polyamorous thing. It was just the fact that she wasn't really like, she knew that she celebrated it like intellectually, but she just had no like life experience with it. So it was very like all of the sort of pair bonding conditioning of like conventional American life seemed to still structure her emotional responses to things of jealousy or feeling of inadequacy. She has, this was like 12 years ago, but like she has since embraced a polyamorous lifestyle for herself, which is wonderful and beautiful. But at the same time, I recognize that her polyamory does have a little bit more of a hierarchical structure. just because she does need to feel very special to one particular person, have that be a very dependable, sort of consistent sort of mirror for her, which is totally fine and valid. It's just not the way that I feel like I want to engage with relationships. So it's
Polyamory with benefits. The
polyamory.
benefit being you have, even though you consider yourself polyamorous, you have that one person that you give more precedence
It's
to.
with benefits kind of like has a connotation to it. I would say maybe polyamory with some additional structure or safety or sense of security. There it is. Extra security within a polyamorous relationship, whereas some people describe themselves as like solo poly, in which they sort of have this attitude of just like, I will not be tied down by anything. I want to be able to make my own decisions. I don't want to be accountable to anybody. Like, if you engage with me, enter at your own risk, kind of thing. Which is a bit like another step beyond where I feel like I am in my relationships, and so
Honestly, I feel like just this topic alone could be the topic point for multiple interviews.
yeah, it's a thing. It's a lot.
But we have other things to talk about.
We do.
And I want to make sure we get to them. But right now, let's take another break.
Yes, thank you.
And when we come back, we will chat a little bit more about go into some of the talents, because we haven't really talked about that, and talk about something called body church
Body church.
when we come back.
Audio's off and video's off.
Yay.
Vimeo and all that. At what point do they hear me? Like, do they hear me right now?
Yes.
Hello, Vimeo.
Ah.
Good to know. I knew that.
Are we broadcasting? Oh yeah.
There you go.
Welcome back to NTR, our segment here at the Nudism.tv studio. My name is Eric, and I'm with Lydia.
Hello.
We're chit-chatting about your life.
My life.
And I understand that something that's near and dear to you, you are
An artiste.
you're an artiste. You went to school for massage.
Massage. I went to school for massage before I left high school, though. When I went to music conservatory for composition and was pursuing this whole thing as an artist and trying to build a career around that, that got a little more complicated.
I see, but now you find yourself a producer of sorts.
Producer of performance art, retreats, workshops, festivals. Yes.
How did you get into? Well, yeah. Just share with us how you became a producer, about how you discovered your passion for this, first of all, and
Right.
how it's come to actually be a thing.
Well, I was exploring erotic performance art because I was, just out of the BDSM community, getting involved in sex work, and I was sort of like, this seems very, relevant to me, very important to me. It was really informing just what I wanted to express in the world. And I was struggling to find appropriate outlets for that, or things where I felt really like I wasn't fighting an uphill battle. And so I went into erotic performance art as a medium, first within sort of the neo burlesque scene in New York. But
Which scene? I'm sorry.
Neo burlesque.
Neo burlesque. Got it.
And that still felt kind of constricting. And I produced a festival called the Sexual Act Festival in 2011, which had a panel discussion on art and intimacy, and a dance night, and an experimental music night, and a sort of a sex workshop thing, and erotic poetry. And
so your function as a producer in that was to find was to put together an itinerary of events that would help to put forth a message.
I'm more of an investigation. I was sort of trying to put out the call of where are these people that are exploring these questions? And at first I thought it was going to be much more of a showcase with a lot of different perspectives. But most of my collaborators sort of showed up and was like, okay, what do we do? And I was like, so it sort of became the Lydia Love show because I was the only one with really clear ideas as to what I wanted to explore. And so I debuted a lot of different choreography and music composition pursuits. And that sort of became the beginning of this company called Passionate Persuasions that sort of has become sort of the vessel for showcasing my work as a producer, as a director.
So Passionate Persuasions.
Passionate Persuasions.
Passionate Persuasions. This was 10 years ago now.
Yes.
Does it feel like 10 years?
Yes.
Does it feel like 20 years?
It feels like a solid 10.
Solid 10,
solidly condensed 10.
It feels like exactly the amount of time that has transpired.
Yes,
so between the days, the infancy in 2011 when you first set about this possibly investigative project to now, how has it evolved? What started as this Lydia Love project? How has it evolved to what it is today?
Right. At first, it was very much about the erotic. The sexual component was very, emphasized.
In what way would the sexual component be emphasized in your production?
It was kind of we were talking about virginity experiences or hypersexualized dispositions, or there was just this sense of very sacred whore sort of dynamics. The topics were all just let's talk about orgasm, let's talk about genitalia, let's talk about what gets us hot. These are the questions that were being put forth in the panel discussion, the workshop, things like that. And then as I started to single out particular collaborators, I connected with this flute player, Martha Cargo. We did a two-woman uh, performance later that year called Dysfunction, which was about perceived and internalized notions of dysfunction with regards to mental health and sexual disposition, where she was exploring sort of being a late bloomer with regards to her sexuality and some experiences with mental health stuff, and I was sort of exploring the contrary of being hypersexual as a child and like some of my mental health stuff. And so I was sort of bringing in that element of vulnerability with regards to just lived experience and sense of concepts of stigma, and then further leaning into that even more in the recent years. It has been not with like sort of diagnosed mental health situations, but like just how mental or emotional intelligence is so relevant to everyone's experience, and how there's aspects of everyone's life and perception and just like the tools we have that is still very much not talked about because it is taboo or there's stigma associated with it. And like while sexuality, desire, mental health are all still part of that, like I really feel like I've arrived at a very stable umbrella approach to what Passionate Persuasions is about. And the tagline is like fighting stigma with intimacy. And like there's this just like a revelatory sort of like exposure of authenticity and lack of inhibitions, non-censoring yourself, and just like letting go of all these ideas of what we're supposed to behave like, what we're supposed to look like.
I feel like anyone that's embracing a close-free lifestyle, that's one of those big barriers that you tear
Right.
down, right? You're supposed to be closed. You're supposed to go out in society, and you're supposed to,
Be embarrassed.
right. You're supposed to be modest, and you're supposed to, the clothing kind of puts out a message about, what you want to be or what you want others to perceive you as.
Mhm.
So if you can just say no to all that, then you're already, I feel you're a good candidate, or you're maybe even more receptive to the kind of message that you are trying to distribute and share
Sure.
with Passionate Persuasions.
Yeah.
Do you find that a lot of the people that you work with are nudists? And also, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about how you find these individuals. How do people sign up to become part of your show or your production?
Yeah, I at first I was trying to like handpick the situation with like, oh, I saw you do such and such, and like every once in a while that works. But for the most part, I've actually had great success with regards to like just like cattle calls. With regard like that's an industry term for just like an open audition process of just being very upfront about what this project looks like, and just like having that deep pool of possibility. The people that come out of the woodwork with regards to that invitation tend to be very exciting collaborators. When I first started working with Martha, she actually was like, I just feel like I would be the last person that Lydia would want to work with, because I'm not at all like sex forward as I was at the time. But it's not necessarily that I'm wanting to just like indulge in other people that sort of reflect back my values. I'm actually very interested in illuminating the transformative process that self-reflection, authentic expression kind of like create for people, both as the performer and as the audience. Because it is very much about permission for me. Like the kinesthetic thing that we were talking about earlier, not only does it invite people to sort of get on my wavelength, but it also gives them permission to get into their bodies. And when I do performances that are very much about forgiveness or patience or like just like sense of self-worth, like a lot of people reflect on how they have their own experience of that in the audience as they're witnessing it.
So a performance of unforgiveness or self-worth, what would that entail?
There's this one performance I did in 2014 with which was a solo cello performance. It was a very conventionally structured classical music kind of recital kind of environment. But the way I worked through it, this sort of like patience, the kinesthetic approach, the embodied authenticity stuff, I talked with the audience like in like these little sort of mini talk back things in between each piece, and sort of like reflected on what they're experiencing, what's coming up for them. And I sort of emphasized from the beginning that they'll find this inclination to hold their breath, that they'll feel like they need to like understand and comprehend all the aspects of the music. But to like, I will let them let go of this preoccupation of like how we've been told we need to digest sort of avant-garde art in the sort of modernist discourse. I tell them to let go of those things and to just experience their emotions in the moment, not necessarily just like wash over them in like a sort of a numb sort of way, but to like really just allow everything to hit them and flow through them, and to reflect and observe and just sort of like allow it all to happen. Because in a lot of ways, the art is designed to make them feel uncomfortable. And a lot, just like because it is very much like, oh, this feels raw, or this feels tender, or this feels stressful or anxiety provoking. Yeah. And to like just like sit with that discomfort and just like allow yourself to have those feelings. There's a very therapeutic, cathartic aspect of that.
Listening to that, it sounds like something that I would be interested. I would benefit from. I think anybody would, but especially me.
Okay.
And it almost, this vibe that you're talking about. It's you're playing some music, right? It was a cello. You're playing, and then you pause, and then you speak a little bit. Mm-hmm. You go back to playing. You go back. It seems very. I feel like the two things that pop into my mind immediately: some NPR segment where there's someone talking, they're playing music, talking, and very kind of soothing, very informational, and the other is like a poetry slam.
Sure.
Yeah, that's like the two things just came to my mind. Firstly, of course, I'd have to see this performance and to really truly appreciate it. It just from the description alone, it seems very appealing.
It is very interesting how I've had to like develop the conversational piece, because I actually did some of my first erotic performance art stuff with regards to slam poetry and sort of like movement with words, kind of stage opportunities. When I first started trying to like have these conversations with the audience, I noticed that I was either super bubbly and excited and like sort of hard to keep track of, or I became very dry and academic. And I was trying to find that balance of like conversational, being able to take someone on a sort of a narrative journey. And so that's when I got into comedy, and like I was like, how do I engage an audience and not lose them, but also take them somewhere? And like, so the segments in between are tend to be fairly charismatic, just because I know people are sort of looking to me to sort of hold that space.
Yeah, sprinkle a little bit of something else there.
How do you mean?
Well, you intersperse a little comedy.
Yeah, entertain them, keep them engaged, keep them relaxed. Whereas, like, if I was just doing it like sort of like a workshop, there'd be very much like a dryness to like, you're just gonna have these feelings and like just like go figure it out on your own. And that's not really the experience I'm looking to impart. But yeah, it's fun. It tends to be very conversational. I got to the end of the night of that concert, for example, and I was sort of anxious that I was like, so this was a lot of time. We've gone a lot of places, blah, blah, blah. How are people feeling? What's their stamina like? And everyone was just like, we're really good.
I mean, honestly,
they felt very engaged. They felt, yeah.
It seems like the kind of thing where if everyone is conversational about it at the end, then you've succeeded.
It was amazing.
Because it seems like the point is to be provoking. It's to allow people to think about and delve into maybe things that they wouldn't normally think about. Right? Exactly. Like you said, take them into this awkward space, but also talk about it to make it less awkward, maybe, or allow them to approach it so that they can benefit from it in their day-to-day life.
Right.
Take the experience from your performance and allow it to enrich their just general life.
Similar to how we were talking about kids earlier, about how you don't need to like give someone dogma to like educate them and give them intelligence about an aspect of life. You just sort of need to expose them to it, and they will like make sense of it on their own terms and take that knowledge with them. So a lot of it is sort of like this exposure. I don't want to say exposure therapy, but there's a therapeutic component there where people feel like they've sort of just been more acquainted with a part of themselves that feels less accessible prior.
And it's good, somebody needed to get them into that mind space.
Without being aggressively sort of with a sort of like a
Surgically, carefully.
well, there's an aggressive message that sort of experimental performance art has, where it's just like, like it's more rebellious and like frustrated. It's like, look at me, deal with me, you closed-minded sheeple or whatever. They get very like, they have this message and they need someone to like feel. The provoking aspect is very much hostile, whereas I try to present this sort of environment of allowance and permission and respect and loving. And it's like it does have like this very woo-woo connotation, but in a lot of ways, it's just like it's very human.
Do you have is there a social media or a website or anything that someone can follow if any of our viewers
Sure.
are interested in finding out more about your work or with Passion Persuasion or anything like that?
Yeah, I passionatepersuasions.com is being developed, and I am mostly on Facebook with regards to a lot of these things. If you find Sarah, Lydia, and Banks, that's sort of like my social personal thing.
Say that once again, slowly.
Sarah, Lydia, and Banks, and it's Sarah without an H, Lydia with a Y, and with an E. So SARA space LYDIA space ANNE space Banks BANKS. I'm the only one you can find. And there's a page associated with that or linked to that profile that is like Lydia Love as just like a performance entity. There's another one that is Passionate Persuasions, which is like totally unpopulated. There's one about Body Church. There's like all these different sort of tributaries of my work that is terribly unorganized. I just hired a social media manager to like get things in a functional state.
Honestly,
so it's getting there.
In this day and age, you got to have that, right? That's the big way to disseminate information.
It is advertising. It's the only way to engage. And I just don't have that disposition.
So passionatepersuasions.com is going to be coming up in the future at some point.
It is happening. It will be, I keep on pushing back the launch date, but it is definitely like in the works. So I'm looking forward to that. There's some in-person events happening in New York City this December that I'm very much excited about. I think passionatepersuasions@gmail.com is probably the most effective way to get more information. I can take someone from that and like put them on a mailing list or just like direct them towards an Eventbrite page where there's like profiles and accounts that they can sort of follow and sort of like keep tabs on things. But yeah, passionatepersuasions@gmail.com is sort of like this hub where everything currently exists before it will be properly formatted on a website.
You heard it here first. Get on that early access.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to make sure that while we were talking about it, people had a way to find out more information so they could maybe browse alongside listening to this. Now, you mentioned it just now, Body Church.
Yes.
What is Body Church?
Body Church was an early attempt or pursuit to sort of codify my embodied relationship with my like physical exploration. Funny, we have not really mentioned contortion. Back when I was first getting into dancing and erotic performance art stuff, I was using flexibility in a lot of those contexts as a model, as a dancer, as a pornographer. And I just am hypermobile. And that was sort of like a career that I thought I might have a chance at. But my handstands weren't strong enough. And, the acrobatic, proper circus dynamic was just not coming together. I was just too artsy for it.
So you were using your talent. I don't know if it's talent or the right word, your natural ability to be flexible in for work.
Yeah, I was trying
It
to
was like
see.
it was a focal point for different types of productions.
I was trying to monetize that skill set, and it didn't really come together. But 3 years of exploring my body in that sort of like hyper developed way, after I'd already been in massage school, after I'd already gone through some authentic movement stuff, the level of insight into like how my body works mechanics wise was really powerful, as far as like how I tended to my body, like my daily stretching routines or self massage techniques that just helped me to like always feel good and sort of free and uninhibited.
Could there be a segment while you're here with us in our studio this week? Could there be a segment devoted to stretching and flexibility and that sort of thing? Is that something that you're knowledgeable about, would want to share with us?
Right. Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. I actually that's what happened. Like I think it was 2013 or something like that, where I was trying to codify all of that into this practice that like is akin to yoga, but like very much minus all of the shoulds and all the sense of like discipline and posture. Whereas body church is very much about listening to the body as far as what it is asking you, as opposed to what you're sort of imposing on the body. And it is very there's a cathartic movement to it. There's sort of like a an openness to sort of looking a fool, so to speak, as opposed to like exhibiting
Poise.
this poised mastery of the body disposition, which is I feel not healthy.
So yoga, excuse me, yoga is this sort of activity, this art form where you subject your body through a series of poses.
Yeah,
Body church is contrarian to that.
there is a contrarian thing to that. I don't want to like put yoga down, especially westernized yoga has become this sort of like almost competitive, aggressively discipline oriented practice. Like actual yoga that's currently practiced in India is actually quite free form as well, and like sort of more relaxed and like um, anyway, I get that. But yeah, there's as because I've gone through a lot of this stuff within a physical therapy frame, I take a lot of the things that we do to our bodies as far as like holding ourselves up and how we, amble around and how we sit, and just like taking the body into the contrary or the muscle into the contrary position, and how we can sort of like engage with the ligaments in a way that sort of like lubricates and sort of just like lets all the little muscular scar tissue or tensions to sort of like breathe and just like sort of reset themselves and just sort of like shake out the sheets a bit,
This description alone, I'm just feeling limber already.
I know,
It
it's
feels
like
amazing. I feel like I'm at a chiropractor's office right now, and they're just fixing everything. They're just squeezing out all the little nooks and crannies.
yeah. Yeah, it's very satisfying, and people feel very energized after, as opposed to like a lot of people after yoga, they feel like this sort of like exhaustion, which is satisfying in its own way. But yeah, just like the increased blood flow, the sense of openness is really satisfying. That and I love sharing it with people. I just haven't really found the context for it yet.
So in its current state, how do you share this body church?
I've had little miniature pursuits of, getting in touch with a movement studio or doing some online stuff. Usually it's a word of mouth thing where I'm just like, okay, you want to do it. You want to do it. When's everyone free? And sort of like more of a collaborative endeavor. Like I said, I actually have a very much a creative mind that is not one for administrative labor. And so as I've been developing passionate persuasions and like registering the LLC and having a payroll of people, of all these people that sort of help to create that infrastructure, Body Church will become a thing that has more of a consistent following, because without that, people don't know, they can't invest in something if it's inconsistent. And I am anything but consistent in a lot of ways. That's why we have businesses, to like hold you up.
Well, I understand that we're going to have a segment with you later regarding body church. So we look forward to seeing that.
Yeah.
Another thing that you spoke about earlier Whispering the Body.
Whispering the Body. That was actually the sex workshop that was part of the first festival. That's what I called that workshop. It was kind of this adaptation of this somewhat problematic technique that was developed back in the 1960s, 1970s called orgasmic meditation, which is like a listening with the pleasure sensors of your fingertips when you're engaging with someone else's body, as opposed to being very like utilitarian and like trying to accomplish something or applying a technique to someone's body because you know it will make them feel good. You're engaging with a sensual dynamic that is also very much about your pleasure. And so extrapolating that concept, that method to a more full body kinesthetic dynamic with someone that is very permissive, very much allowing for the levels of awkwardness with people's bodies and sort of just like existing there and not being like shying away. Because when you touch someone else's body, especially like I knew this from a massage therapist perspective, if you are like sort of awkward or tentative in your touch of certain parts of your body, you're communicating this message that that part of their body is uncomfortable or inappropriate or there's just like that message is communicated of like, by the way, this is something that needs to be protected or I don't know. There's not an openness there. I'm not finding my words. And so I will typically, when I first engage with someone's body within like the whispering the body context, I will almost immediately go to those places of discomfort and just like sit with them. Like if I just like place my face against someone's inguinal crease, where there's like people tend to move through that space like quickly because there is a lot of vulnerability in that. Or if I take the back of my hand on someone's like between their breasts, there's always like this tendency to like engage and like grab and like be entertaining almost with your touch. And if you like just do the opposite and sort of just sit with the fact that there's an allowance, there's a permission, there's a patience, there's no need to like rise to this occasion of, oh, we're dealing with bodies, so I hope I'm not boring, and like this need to entertain, which I also engage with as from an artistic perspective, but like specifically with regarding someone's body, it seems to have this very just soothing, gentle sort of therapeutic release for people.
To me, it sounds very. It sounds like an appealing experience because
one would hope.
Well, no, one would hope, but no, you're right. People, certain parts of the body, it's like you just kind of skimp over it to get to the good stuff, right? You rush through it because you're expected to be doing something else. It's kind of like this intermediate step.
There's an anxiety as well because, and I think sort of especially with I guess social media now, where like you skip through the boring parts in every regard of how you present yourself to the world. You're like, these are the money shots, these are the high points, and it's gone. Like, what else is entertaining? What's going to get my engagement? And so like the thing about orgasmic meditation, it was part of this thing called the slow sex movement. And what there's people are familiar with like the slow food movement, slow walking, slow business, slow relationships, whatever. Like people have different ways of engaging with this need to slow down and not be ruled by anxiety or rushing or expectation or competitiveness. So yeah, I've sort of applied that to physical relationships, intimate relationships, artistic relationships. So that's the sort of thing.
Now, there's this whispering the body, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does it go hand in hand with any of your other performances or any of the other things that you do within your production?
A bit with regards to like some of the feminist pornography things that are like just on the horizon. When I noticed how significant the sexual part was for me and how at the same time there's this whole other just like vulnerability based endeavor that is not contingent on the sexual engagement, I realized I needed to sort of like allow those things to exist separately. So I came up with this Sans Inhibition choreography project and intimate artistry as a methodology with musical improvisation. So I have these two sort of like collaborative entities that sort of exist outside of the erotic, just so they are more accessible because not everyone's journey is specifically centered around sex, and that's fine. Um, it took me a while to come to that like acceptance of just like, no, you mean not everyone's gonna just like end up in this big orgy in the apocalypse because that's what I want. But
I mean, that makes sense, right? You mentioned yourself that when you started, it was more erotic in nature, and as you progress, you found the sweet spot where there's elements of eroticism and elements of kind of self-awareness and that sort of thing.
yeah, you know.
So that's the same point.
Yeah, and it opened up the collaborative streams of people that weren't specifically sex workers or people that were part of that lifestyle.
And undoubtedly, some of those people that you now are discovering because you're, maybe not focusing so much on the erotic aspect, still can appreciate some of the erotic nature to some of your other.
Exactly. The funny thing that has happened with this some of my improvisers is they will the emotional intelligence piece, the ability to like explore boundaries in a very calm but very clear way. Um, it sort of has informed their relationships in general, their ability to relate to their family, their romantic, their friendships, their professional relationships, and they will suddenly notice sort of like this transformation of how they relate to not just their emotional but their sexual ways because there's an agency about one's experience when you have that emotional education that just wouldn't be accessible otherwise. So even if I'm not talking about sex, I still am talking about sex just because it's human relationships.
It all boils down.
Bam. And I have a little soundbite there.
We'll have to edit that in. And now the soundbite to indicate that we're going to take another break.
Yeah.
And we'll come back. We'll wrap things up. I do want to talk a little bit more about intimate artistry and movement immediacy.
That's an interesting one.
We'll get into it when we come back.
Appreciate it.
It's still, I just don't know if we had it set up as
I
a third
tripped.
intentionally or
I think I
separate.
tripped. I don't even know what it was. It didn't feel like it was a lot, but
Yeah.
Good.
all right. We have
Thanks
such
for
close
participating,
quarters,
guys.
and I'm leggy AF.
Hmm.
How tall are you?
Yes.
6'3".
6'4" and 3/8.
God, I wish I was 6'1".
I wish I was 5'10".
You're on.
All right. So keep so suddenly. Give me a moment.
I'm going to try to be more grounded because I feel like I've been going very fast.
No, it's fine. It's great. You've been doing a great
so
job.
much energy.
No. That's good. Honestly, energy's great. We love energy.
I guess that's true.
And we're back
Hmm.
in the Nudism.tv studio here with Lydia, and we are finishing or working on concluding our Nudist Talk Radio segment. This segment where we get to chat with our guests and find out what makes them tick and learn all sorts of interesting things about them and hopefully pave the way for the remainder of the week and your time with us, and we can do these new exciting segments like the Body Church and any others that you want to share with us. One thing we left off at prior was something called movement immediacy. What do these words mean to you, and what should they mean to us?
As quarantine sort of started to shape sort of a new vision of how my art might need to work, because I'm very much a performance, live theater kind of person, was making how I was going to engage with the medium of video, of expressing myself in a visual context. And I'd always been a model, where I like really loved how photographers would engage with me. And like as a dancer, it was very much documentary of just like static things. But I think even when I was first starting to produce things at the festival in 2011, I was already telling people to be like, yeah, just get in there and like have like the much more like handheld dynamic work. And it was actually when I was trying to imagine this porn project called Capturing Intimacy that unfortunately didn't end up happening, but it sort of got me thinking about cinematography. And I'm getting to the movement immediacy thing eventually. But basically, there was this visceral quality that I was looking for of not being a neutral observer of a scene, an erotic scene, but literally having the story being communicated, being the erotic experience of the camera person, not like a POV kind of like trying to imagine some, idealized lover, but like what it means to literally engage in the video process, how to affect a scene through observing it, what voyeurism and sort of, I don't know, just like to be a performer. As when I'm engaging with a camera, I feel very sort of enlivened because to be captured, to be sort of almost measured through pixels and lighting and like this whole thing, like my whole system just sort of comes, heightened and alive. And I kind of wanted to express that from the other side. And so when I tried to convey that to cinematographers, they loved all the, the flowery painting, words. But when they got in there, they still had all this industry training, this sort of like calculating, very sort of measured, choreographed kind of attitude
It's
toward
hard
it.
to undo.
It was very hard. And I later, like a year later, I was doing something with my string quartet where I wanted to get that sort of visceral cinematography kind of thing within like a music video context for the quartet, and it was just so it was still very like slow and plodding and not the chaos that I was sort of envisioning. And I was like, you know what? It'll be easier for me to teach dancers how to hold a camera than it is for me to get these industry professionals to not move like Teamsters and with some passion and some
Yeah, when
some
there's that much passion at stake, you can't afford to have anything holding you back, slowing you down.
Yeah, there needs to be a total inhibition. And so I started auditioning dancers and saying, like, we're going to eventually be giving you cameras and you're going to be needing to explore that passionate, visceral attitude through your hand and movement from sort of like a shooting from the hip kind of way. And that sort of reminded me of a puppet and how you sort of embody your entire self from this like single extremity. So I developed this concept of visceral puppetry videography. And when I was auditioning those people, I was trying to break it up into these individual components. And one of the audition segments was movement immediacy. And it's kind of this heightened embodiment space where emotional relationships are just like instantaneous. So improvisation, just like with no filter, no process, just like immediate, just like reflection. And so I would have like a musician be performing, or if it was like an erotic context, if there's someone doing a scene, and the dancer would sort of like engage from a distance and just sort of like go into this abstract emotional space of trying to live and manifest what it feels like in that emotional relationship, and just let your body be this conduit for uh, internal experience.
So, what was the viewer?
I know, there's a lot.
No, what was the intended response for the viewer? What were you hoping that the viewers would glean? How would they, respond to this, and what would they sort of learn from it?
Well, it was sort of like a step along the process of like taking that and then eventually sort of like channeling it into camera movement. But to originally have that sort of foundation and just like a full unfettered access to one's internal experience. So the full manifestation of it with a hand is sort of like this, just like a non-thinking sort of direct expression, movement of the camera of just like, oh, I enjoy this. And this like having like a no concern like for like what it's supposed to look like, but just like how it feels to take a camera and put it up in someone's face in this way, or like behind their body in this way, or like up and above and around. Blah, blah, blah. So it's very immersive. That's the word I've been using about it.
Immersive.
Yeah.
So you're expecting these performers to just do things that they just whatever comes to mind. The first thing comes to mind, just it doesn't matter how bizarre, ludicrous, out of context it is, just go for it. And that's the beauty of it.
That's the beginning of it. Something that I've been working as a director is we all have these different sort of like dials and switches and levers in our body as far as like how we express ourselves, even within the context of like no inhibitions and total freedom. Like there's still like tendencies in our body of like we tend to like swallow our the ends of our sentences. I tend to hold my chin a little down for whatever reason. All these different like eccentricities of the body that we don't do intentionally. And so I'm like watching something, a video or someone's musical performance or whatever, and I'm like, okay, let's look at what you were experiencing internally, and let's see what was communicated externally. What does the audience experience from watching you? And are there little parts? It's just like color correcting a video or an image. You're not like airbrushing it and changing the actual image, but you might be like heightening the contrast or just like raising the hue a little bit just to be like, this is what it actually looked like. This is what the internal experience actually was. So there's little tweaks to like the expressiveness of it, or the intelligibility of it. Getting someone to articulate themselves with regard to their emotional experience a little bit. So it's little tweaks like that. It's not total chaos, but it is very much originates from that raw, authentic foundation.
And that is
a lot.
Movement immediacy.
Well, that's movement immediacy is like just like a specific manifestation of what is essentially intimate artistry methodology. And that was sort of like the first thing I sort of started developing, and it started having these different branches.
What other branches have we not talked about that you would like to share?
Sans Inhibition choreography project has been really interesting for me. It was, I think it was the first collaboration that really made me feel like I had arrived as a creator, where I was just like, oh, this feels like a fantastic balance of just like rawness and technique and chemistry and production value. Um, the dancer Ilona Bito in New York was like my central collaborator there, and we would do these duets of like lifting and sort of these sort of almost acro balancing kind of things. And she's a professional dancer. She has this extraordinary body awareness because we do contract improv together. And so there's like this knowledge of improvisation, but this sort of openness to the sensual, the tender, the we did power dynamics where there's like a very much a surrender thing where I was like sort of taking her body into positions that require a great deal of trust, like these sort of inversions or like exaltations. Where there's one image where she's like sitting on my shoulder and like I have like her leg sort of balanced on one of my arms, and she literally does a back bend off the other side of me, and I just sort of counterbalance her. She has this extraordinary arc, and then like sort of like just like there's an extraordinary amount of technique there, but there's also a huge amount of just like letting go. That was really beautiful, and like our entire just stream of improvised choreography in these performances was just it just felt so good. And then the audiences also responded with like this huge enthusiasm that it wasn't just about, oh wow, you do all these spectacular things, but like, oh my gosh, I felt this connection between you so immediately, this potent cathartic just deliciousness that we were expressing in our bodies, that I was like, oh, I think I'm ready to like get back into producing. I'm getting back into, because I was sort of like in this little mental health hiatus in a lot of ways. And this sort of like showed me that I was like, got me a lot of very encouraged, very excited, inspired. And then, a year later, I started the Intimate Artistry Quartet. And then a year after that, I was getting into the porn projects, and it just sort of snowballed after that collaboration with Ilona.
So where's that snowball today? What is your next big project?
Well, in New York, the string quartet is doing their first live performance on December 12th in the East Village at the Wow Cafe Theater. And that is going to be sort of a works in progress of just where the quartet's right now in this sort of like movement-based sonic landscape improvisation. And also I have a few erotic film tests, new collaborators, new videographers that I'm sort of testing out to see how their vision overlaps with mine and how we can sort of like put some things together. I've already done a few projects from like this past spring and then like back a year ago, and so I have some things in the chamber that I'm like. I was waiting around for Cinekink to like do their next erotic film festival, and then I realized like, wait a second, I'll just produce my own erotic film festival and invite all these people to sort of like come and share their work and talk about it. And so featuring that next incarnation of my sort of attitude towards performance and media feels really sort of on the tip of my tongue right now. I feel really excited about the string quartet. I feel really excited about Sans Inhibition. I guess because my life is very sexual, like I just have an extraordinarily high libido, almost to like a sort of a way that is almost difficult to handle for myself. And it was just such an integral part to my artistic development that returning to it feels really satisfying, to like allow this huge passion of mine of physical intimacy to have this very nuanced artistic utterance to it. It just feels really juicy for me, and I feel like that was probably what was missing in my previous attempts as a performance artist. I was sort of like not reading the audience very well, and it was sort of going over or under people's heads. And I
And
feel
all
like
of-
I can really express myself now.
And all of this is part of Passionate Persuasions.
Essentially, yeah.
Well, I look forward to seeing this grow and flourish.
I
it seems like
know.
you have a lot of ideas, and you have
There's
a lot
so
of
many.
connections and a lot of experience too. This isn't something new for you. You've been doing this for at least a decade.
Yeah.
So I wish you luck, and
Thank you.
hopefully in the future, when our paths cross again, you'll have something new and exciting to share about Passionate Persuasions.
It'll never stop.
You mentioned a string quartet.
Mhm.
What about making it a nudist string quartet?
Oh my gosh, there's a story there.
Go on.
Okay, this is related to BDSM stuff as well. But when I was first imagining how to take my sort of sensual embodied world into my musical world, like the first time I engaged with intimate artistry back in 2010 with my cello, it was very much taking that sort of sensual engagement that I would have with someone's body, but applying it to my instrument and letting my hands just sort of dance as would delight them, so to speak. And so when I was imagining ways of like having sonic implications of that, because in a lot of ways the cello is just sort of like this acoustic resonator of the activities of my hands, and I was like, I'm imagining a BDSM or sadomasochistic quartet of 4 percussionists playing, or 4 sadistic percussionists playing 4 masochistic vocalists, and having sensuality and orgasm and pain and just like all these different sort of proprioceptive and sort of jerking or whatever it is that you sort of engage with someone's body to maybe disorient them or make them feel, protected, and like all these different bodily relationships to elicit sounds from them, not necessarily operatic, projecting like these are notes, but like just like anything of vocalization that might come from them, and have that be the material for a sonic landscape that 4 duos would basically explore together. It's very complicated as far as like how you rehearse something like that and how you develop those relationships where like the percussionist and the vocalist will sort of like develop a mutual vocabulary such that the percussionist can like be like, I want this kind of sonic experience, and be able to like know where on that person's body they can go to without having like some sort of pre-planned instructions. But
It seems like a lot of this would be it's spontaneous. The beauty's in the spontaneity.
There's also a lot of beauty in the authenticity of it. Like you can do something randomly, but it's not necessarily authentic. I think the level of immediacy with that practice is very exciting for me, and finding someone that can so transparently express their internal experience through vocalization, it's just a vision to behold. It's just like extraordinary.
It seems like you'd have to really find very specific people that maybe fit that sort of talent subset.
Which is my life. That is my job as a producer.
I can understand that that's a difficult task to find. Not just, but you needed 8 people. Then there's 4 duos.
Essentially, I mean, like when you're composing, you have to let yourself just like run wild with like what would be the most exciting thing possible, and just like see if it's possible.
Definitely, though, I think there should be. This idea is great, and it's a very interesting one. But even something simple like. And I say simple because that seems more complicated. Just a string quartet playing, but naked.
Right.
And in New York, it's legal, right? New York is very friendly as far as sort of nudity laws are concerned.
I imagine, yeah, within like closed environments, I'm sure it is fine being legal or fine being legal, fine being naked. I think when you're out in public, there's people are allowed to be topless regardless of body type. But I guess there's a question of I remember when I was doing the 2011 the sexual act thing where intimate artistry first got started, and there was a question of why Martha was in her underwear because we were doing like this this piece where I was dancing and she was playing flute, and we sort of had this sort of like interaction, like not a physical interaction, but one of proximity, and one of sort of like, it was like a cat and mouse dynamic. And people were sort of like, why was that decision made? And it just felt organic to like just like have this heightened sense of vulnerability or exposure. For example, I did a duet dance during the festival where me and my partner were naked. We weren't being explicitly sexual, but we were being very sensual and tender with each other. And I think it's just a matter of asking the question of what does this want to be, rather than what would make this more exciting. Because I think that that motivation of like what would make this more exciting gets into sensationalism and sort of like gimmicky stuff. So like asking those from a more artistically like what necessitates this message being expressed. I'm not sure what a string quartet that just happens to be naked, unless they're in an environment where nakedness is just like the norm. Sure, they might be naked. Like having it be in the score of like, hey, by the way, this is a string quartet and you all need to be naked for this performance, and then like not address it artistically, like feels a little arbitrary.
So you're saying there should be some context to it beyond just naked for no reason.
Yeah, I think to be sensational with regards to nudity does not help the nudism like agenda, so to speak, if it be so blunt. I feel like a lot of that references back to that sort of hostile, rebellious association, like with 1960s or 1970s, where it's like, we want to make art and there's just going to be a naked woman standing on stage and it's just going to be radical and really shove it in people's faces how closed-minded they are. And I was like, okay, that might be necessary, and like that sort of volatility of artistic expression of like sort of really stomping on the nerve of whatever the conflict is. I don't feel like that's where the artistic community is right now, or what is productive. But to each their own.
I think that in the way I perceive it is, you have. I don't. I was a percussionist back in in high school and in college, but I don't really play much anymore. But I would imagine that if I was in a string quartet, or if I had the talents to play in a string quartet, but I also had had this fascination with or just lived close free when I could. It would be nice to be able to combine both together, because typically you think string quartet or you think any sort of performance, people are clothed, they're wearing whatever, but something as classical as a string quartet mixed with the ability to just be naked and play and still create this beautiful music and still have this harmony. I think there's still some beauty in that.
I mean, there's not beauty in that. I think it's interesting, and maybe just because it is not really my particular like political agenda of nudism as a lifestyle, where being naked is seen as an activity, almost like we're going to go have like this meal with friends and we're all going to be naked because that is going to be sort of like the thing that we do. We're going to do this thing and we're going to be naked. Like those are two activities that are being put together. Whereas for me, it's just not a thing where I feel like it's expressing something, and that's very specific to me. It's something I've come across with regards to just the nudism community, like at the Touch and Play Festival, where people are like, this is very much a statement of we're going to be naked, we're going to be sex positive, we're going to explore these things, and it is taboo and it is uncomfortable, and this is sort of a liberation for a lot of those attendees. Whereas for me, I'm coming to that space and it is actually one of the more conservative, structured environments that I engage with. Whereas for a lot of people, it's the opposite experience of liberation versus containment.
No, I understand. You're on a different spectrum. They're on a different spectrum. What's brash to them can be tame for you, etc.
Or what's exciting might be
Right.
inconsequential.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. You mentioned. I think you mentioned in some capacity during our interview, but you certainly mentioned during your brief write up for us before you came on the show, that nudity isn't sexualized at sex parties.
Mhm.
Now, explain that to us. Explain it to the viewers how you can go to a sex party and nudity itself isn't sexualized, because I think there's a very important takeaway here.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think it overlaps a little bit with like just like the BDSM community as well, but sex positivity and just the environment of bodies being bodies and having natural inclinations or situations. I've noticed that when you've created this structure of a scene where something is expressed explicitly, whether that be domination or sexual lust or whatever like seems to be your like the reason you're there to whether it's to play or to just exist or whatever, to be a voyeur, like when it's contained and there's like a time to do that, it allows the time that's not that to not be that. So there's like there's a fissure between uh, all of the things that are associated. Like if you plan a time to stress about life, it allows you to relax otherwise. And so in the sex party scene, like if you're not actively sexualizing someone's body because you are literally trying to build an erotic connection with them, otherwise they're just like another person sitting next to you on the couch talking about their kids. It's like they might be wearing very lovely lingerie or like some leather bondage stuff, but in a lot of ways they're just sort of in between scenes, and like for them to put on clothes and like do all this, and it sort of like further removes that, and in a lot of ways it's just functional. Just like when I go to sex parties, there's this funny thing where you try to like put something underneath you so your whatever juices might be emitting from your body doesn't get on the furniture. There's just like this common courtesy. And so like robes and like flowy capes that are like easy to take off and on might not be your immediately thought of like sexiness. You're like, I want to wear a corset, I want to have this whole negligee thing, but it's just like it's kind of not functional. So you actually approach the sex parties from not necessarily what would be sexy, but what would be convenient. It's very much, yeah, you just want to be comfortable, you just want to exist.
And so it's a great point to hear, because a lot of people conflate nudism with sexuality, just being naked. They'll say, oh, well, and I'm not even talking about naked people at a sex party. I'm talking about naked people at a park, naked people in their backyard, naked people doing literally anything.
Sunbathing,
so
right, yeah.
That's sexual already, but it's not the case, of course.
Yeah, I think there's a scarcity model there, if you want to get into like economics of there's a excess that gets associated with something that isn't otherwise available. So you sort of indulge and want to like have all the things if you have access to it. And if you are extremely sexually frustrated, if you do not have exposure to people on an intimate level on a regular basis, then you will, you will sort of like take something and just like almost rip it to shreds with desire. And so, when you go into the sex positive community, for example, or the nudism community, the sense of abundance is very much part of that rhetoric or that reality of sort of like just existing in a place where things are available and okay and embraced and totally just like part of the conversation, as opposed to something that has to be like frantically fought for. So it's I mean, in a lot of ways, it is sort of what we've inherited from a puritanical, origin of the country.
Taboo.
Yeah, of this shaming of bodies and sexuality, and just like the fact that we are, animals with needs, as opposed to like this sort of 18th century, 19th century disposition of like to transcend and like the Enlightenment, and we're just going to like master our environment, impose upon the environment our intellectual superiority, and like to disregard the body because it is dirty and less than, and how that was sort of put in a time capsule and like planted in America, and like we just like have like this idea, it's like this is the world, but like Europe saw that wasn't working and kind of continued to develop. And so it's very,
America is definitely behind in a lot of ways and that sort of thing, like this puritanical, this shame,
yeah.
it's deeply rooted in kind of the founding of the country, and it's
Yeah.
still it's still prevalent. But these are some of these walls that we're trying to break down.
Mhm.
We want to illustrate that you can be naked and it doesn't have to be sexual. You can be naked at a sex party and it doesn't have to be sexual, right? A sex party is the most sexual place you could probably be, and being naked is not consent. It is not right alone.
Sure.
On its own. It is not. You know, if you're sitting
real.
there in between things, you're just existing. You're talking about your children, like you said, or you're having a sip of water, right?
Yeah, and I think seeing bodies as just having needs and functions is kind of the takeaway for me there. Of just when I see someone at a sex party and they just look amazing, their outfit is on point, and I just saw them in this super hot scene. Like when they're out of that scene, I'm not looking at them going like, oh, what would I do to that body? Oh, look at their juicy ass or whatever. I sort of watch them and I sort of look at them as a human being that is like engaged with this aspect of their spiritual, emotional needs, and sort of reflecting on them as like if I look at someone that just came off the stage from doing this huge musical, performance, I'm looking at them going like, wow, look at this human that is just like sort of at the height of their expression. And that's when I see someone at a sex party, that's how I feel.
I think that's a great outlook. That's a proper outlook.
Yeah.
One thing that I find, I don't know, interesting is the right word, or just something worth at least talking about, and I'd like to get your opinion on it. A lot of our guests that have been here in our Nudism.tv studio also have a presence in the BDSM community.
Right.
Is there any reason why you may think that a nudist community and the BDSM community overlap?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you think they overlap?
I see a correlation, not a causation. I see the sort of the ethos of the BDSM community to be, whatever works for you, like don't yuck someone's yum, all these different sort of like aphorisms. And I think the question of a lot of people find the BDSM community first, and then they're like, oh, by the way, nudism is totally like a convenient way of existing, or a comfortable way, or a liberating way, whatever. The funny thing about sexual desire or BDSM inclinations is the fact that you kind of can't be happy without them. Like without that need being met, you suffer. And so there's like this motivation to go seek out and proactively engage with that thing that you need. Whereas there are some lifestyles of, the Bohemian lifestyle or nudism or some like organized religions that like have an associated lifestyle that you sort of eventually discover, like because you're doing something that puts you in that context and you're just like, oh, this makes sense to me, as opposed to like having a something that you are literally pursuing and you have an agenda. So I think it's sort of like a parallel crossover where a lot of people will find the BDSM community and then they'll notice that this whole world of permission is accessible to them. I'm sure there are people that don't fit that paradigm, but that is often the experience that I notice when I talk to people about their history.
It's nice to hear. I mean, you've been in these scenes for a long time, so what you've seen will matter more than anything I could possibly.
A little legitimate. There's a legitimacy.
Yes,
there.
you have a slight air of legitimacy too. No, but before we began this project, I never expected that these two spheres would intersect as often as they happen to be.
Mm-hmm.
Either it's been very coincidental, or this is just kind of a thing. And according to you, it makes sense why those two could coexist, and why you would find that people that participate in one also participate in a second.
Yeah, just the ideology of permission, and being like, if there's something that you like, there's probably other people in the world that like that too, and it is it is accessible and realistic and appropriate for you to go find those people and coexist and enjoy this thing that you like. And I think that's very just like true in most things in life, but there.
It seems obvious, right?
Yeah, it's just like, oh, obviously. Community, important, huh?
Permission and consent. No, and that's a topic that comes up very often now, is consent and permission, and that's what it's all about.
Yeah, that's an interesting part of it. I get into a lot of, again, you've already learned I have opinions about everything and they go very deep.
And it's a great thing. You're a great guest to have on the show. It's you have a lot of passion, you have a lot of energy, you have experience, and it was great to hear from you about your story, about what brought you here, about your recent passions with your production and with your family and your own interests. Clearly a very sexual being, and that kind of weaves its way into essentially everything. It seems like so much of your your main focus and your main passions.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like when I think about the fact that I have such a high libido, that I kind of, if I'm not having my sexual needs met, it kind of like shapes my entire social life of like, just like if I'm at a dance thing, I'm sort of like always looking at the next body that I get to interact with and have this sort of like proximal intimacy with. And when I'm actually satisfied, I'm able to just like exist in that space and not feel so consumed and preoccupied with
Pressure's
that.
off.
Yeah, it's very like the sense of scarcity and abundance. It's very much what I find to be the core seed of mental health and happiness and contentment, is just a sense that you have your needs met, or you can get your needs met. So yeah, I think for me, it's very much just, I'm a kinesthetic person. I value intimacy, and everything else just sort of comes from that.
I think that's a beautiful way to wrap up our discussion with you.
Thank you.
It was nice to chat with you. It was nice to talk with you. Again, pleasure to hear about your experiences. And we hope that during your stay with us here in Cleveland for the next week, we get to dive a little bit deeper into these various subjects and learn even more.
This is going to be so much fun.
I think so too. I hope you've had a good time thus far. And
yes, thank you.
Lydia, it was a pleasure to chat with you. Once again, can you remind us of the website that we should be looking out for?
Sure. passionatepersuasions.com/passionatepersuasions@gmail.com. Lydia Love is the fan page on Facebook, as well as there is a page for Passionate Persuasions and for Body Church, but those things are sort of not super, they're not currently active, but they will be active very soon. On Instagram, there's Gender Bending Contortion, which is sort of like my old modeling contortion page. And then Sans Inhibition is also a page on there for me and my collaborations with Alona Bito.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Lydia, it was a pleasure.
Bye. Hey.
We do 10 seconds for room tone, please.